railway arch over the top of it, the bridge, and the railway went over the top. All right. Yeah, what we have here is, to say, the railway came over the top. There's a masonry arch bridge to carry the twin track over the top. But immediately in front of us is a property which today is a private dwelling, so we're not permitted to go in there. But it was originally constructed as the Browns Temperance Hotel. But it would appear that it was not used for hotel purposes, but ended up being used for miners' accommodation, and then at a later date became the village shop. And there are photographs showing that with advertising logos in the front windows and the door, with if you like, little pup carts and things, and people milling around in the front. So that was sort of the general supply store to the hill. But of course, once the mines are gone,
there's a coach coming, so you need to
make sure all back in. There's no economic reason to keep the shop here, and therefore.
You weren't getting off the road.
It ended up.
What was the population of the villages around here then? A couple of hundred?
You had about 250 miners.
Oh, right, and their families, yeah.
Time, and their families. So you may have had perhaps as much as 500 plus people residing on the hill. 15 or so dwellings at that point, and again miners and their families. There's nothing left of that little community at all. That is entirely gone. And buildings remained derelict until 1907. However, there was a very brief revival period at that time. The mining syndicate that needed to operate the incline, because again it was a gravity operated incline, needed some ballasting equipment or material to work the incline. So they went across to the Rallis Cross mine, blew up the buildings, what was left, and used the masonry to counterbalance the incline. Fortunately, somebody kept the two date stones and have incorporated them in their gate pillar. A lot of people look at it and might think, well, is that the postal address? You know, the typical cast iron Victorian post box. But of course, that has been, as there's no village here now, there's also no need for a post box either. So that has also been removed. I made a mention, I'll just read that, there's an artist's impression of like looking through that gateway, and you can see how they feel. There's the archway, there's that stores, that's the terrace of houses that used to run back through. But I say that, but that's if you like, an artist's reconstruction, and I'll just show you the little chapel, here we are, known as the Tin Church, and that is sited just within that square, that enclosure. And looking back towards the direction that we're aiming for now, there's the little footpath that ran up against the embankment to go up to the top of the incline. But that also doubled up as the village school. And again, the dates are significant. 1861 was the opening of the school, and they had, if you like, tea and refreshments in there, and there was about 50 children apparently attended the school at that time. That building stayed there until the closure of the mines. When it was then subsequently dismantled and taken away, And it ended up, and I'll use it there, it ended up, and this is the copy Roy gave me, he knows about this. There's a photograph there, it ended up at Watchet at the paper mill. And there it is there, rebuilt, and there's a tremendous fire going on at the paper mill, and we understand that the building was subsequently destroyed. But the little bell in the bell tower we got there resides in the Watchet Museum. So that was salvage. But I say that picture there of 1911 was the fire at the mill, paper mill.
I think the other little thing you've missed out is the miners sent their children to school, for which they paid 1 penny per week.
Wow.
And apparently they're in the records, it indicates that, of course, they had to have, unsurprisingly, school inspectorate that came along, and actually they commended that they felt that the children were being taught adequately. Okay, well, as far as the village goes, there was no doctor at all for the whole of the village. Nearest doctors would either be towards Roadwater or to Wiveliscombe, and they would have to be sent for. But they did have a midwife here, so the midwife probably would have to have doubled up with most of those sort of duties. Likewise, there was no constabulary here either, and as you can imagine, miners working hard in the mines because it was 6 days a week, and it was also 2 shifts. They worked right round the clock. Reason being, when you're underground, it doesn't matter whether it's day or night, it's all dark, and therefore you can work all that period of time. So 2 shifts. The only break would be was when they changed over a shift, they would do the blasting at the end of a shift, and then it would allow a couple of hours for the fumes to disperse before the next shift would go in, and then they would then start clearing the rock that had been blasted out. Quite thirsty work, but being a Welsh maintained, it was very much a teetotal enterprise here, and they frowned upon the demon drink. However, miners would frequent the Rally's Cross, which was their local pub, and there is a record of fights breaking out between the various groups of miners, no doubt disputing whether who was the best miners, Cornishmen or the locals or the Welsh. And there was recorded something like 70 miners in the Rally's Cross with a fight. And somebody had to ride their horse to get the police, which was Brompton Regis.
Oh, blimey.
Which is, by the time they got the policemen across, it had all been settled.
You ça change, eh?
There is an interpretation board on the wall, but I will just give you a little bit of verbal on its interpretation. So this is the winding house, which is a key feature of the enterprise. We've got, and you'll see as we go down, the railway from Watchet to Coombe Road, which is at the base of the incline, only raises somewhere just over a couple of 100 feet in altitude. However, we're up about 1,300 feet. So you've got that last stretch to pull up, and there's at least an 800-foot climb from the base of the incline to the top, which had to be accommodated all within 3/4 of a mile. I need to say it is the main part. And the way that this was achieved was by placing 2 large cast iron winding drums inside the building, both on a common axle. And the cable would, on this side, would come under through that duct on the underside of this drum. And conversely, there was a cable that came over the top of the roof of the other drum. So that as one wound up, the other unwound. The locomotive would bring the ore wagons across the roof of the building. I'll just show you a picture there. There's a picture of the type of locomotive that was used. This is taken on the top of this incline, above, ran over the top of the roof of this building. So just in the background you can just see Seaview House, the gable end of Seaview House, which is looking at the top there. So we know that this picture was taken just at the top here. Twin track on a timber deck made out of railway sleepers, covered in pitch to waterproof it. And on this side was the winding man's accommodation, a little cottage called Drum Cottage. This is 2 up, 2 down. It didn't have the walls as they're shown here, but it was as it's shown in that diagram, or that artist's impression. A little lean-to slated roof, and you can see the sort of slight indications of a pitch going out. And that would have been the same on the other side. So you have these two parts. Fireplace in the far side and fireplace on this side, which was later used as a forge when they discontinued it as a cottage. And a blacksmith hearth was built in here. Where these bolts are, and why you don't crack your shins on them, but these bolts held 4 fabricated wrought iron trusses, and those went up to this height, to this buffer block, those 2 timber bolts of timber, and fitted on the top of those frames are these large plumber blocks, which are the bearing blocks that will support the two drums. So really the working floor height is really up here, at a sort of first floor level. The far side at the early time was used then as a workshop, so that would have been the first workshop, that side. Again, they needed a forge, so there was a chimney, a blacksmith's hearth that side, so that they could finish this building off, because if you think about it, to get these 2 drums in, you couldn't have lifted them in. You would have had to have brought them in, and there's no clear indication of actually how they got them here. The records said that some of the shippers, they were cast in South Wales, and some of the shippers would not ferry them because they felt that they would be unstable on the vessel and weren't prepared to take the risk. However, by some means or another, the drums did arrive here, but they would have had to have been brought in, mounted on the framework, and then the 2 walls built in around it and roofed over accordingly.
That wasn't powered in any way, it was purely one against the other.
It purely, at a counterbalance, worked by gravity. The heavy iron ore, you have about 5 tons in a truck going down, is capable of bringing up coal of equal volume, but because of the relative difference in the densities, the heavier iron ore would pull up coal, or it would also bring up balks of timber, because some of the, these big balks of pitch pine would have been needed, or typical of these would have been needed for mine timbers, for props, etc. So they had to import all the timber as well. Perhaps some local timber would be used, but most of the timber you see around here, all the pine, all the conifers you see, are all later pines, only date from the First World War, not from the period at that time.
So was all this land wooded, do you think?
No, most of it would have been moorland, just rough moorland. I mean, some of like Treeborough Common wasn't ploughed and seeded until 1960s. So it would have been quite poor, gruffy ground at the time.
I think there's some significance in the fact that there's metal framing of the windows.
Yes, I'm just going to come on to that.
Right.
I'll give you the clue. Right, So that's how the building operated until, as I say, the closure of the mines, 1883. However, there was an obligation to keep the railway running until the end of the mining leases, and they didn't expire until 1919, which presented the Ebervale Company in a bit of a difficulty because they were underwriting, in effect, the railway. With no freight, no iron ore freight going down, there was nothing to counterbalance the incline. So they got over that problem by, on that base there, installing a Roby twin-cylinder steam engine, which was then geared to the axle shaft, and that would enable any loads to be hauled up by just using the power of a steam engine. But of course that was the problem. They then needed not only coal, so they cut that coal chute in that corner to allow the coal to be dropped in from the top down to fire the boiler, but also there's no water here, and they needed obviously water for the steam engine. As I've mentioned about the dam that was put in 1883 down the adit, and the water cascades out the top, that allowed that water then to be piped by gravity, but it will only get to the base of this engine house, and literally just in front of that part there is a shaft that drops down. It goes down about 6 metres. It has been investigated, and a plunger pump, which is shown here, this plunger pump, because we know this is a late picture, operated in the cistern and would pump water up to the top to a water tower, and there are contemporary photographs showing a water tower on the top, and that would then allow by gravity water to feed not only this engine but also feed the locomotive, because previously the water for the locomotive had been obtained from Gutworthy, and that mine had closed. They continued on and struggled on for another 15 years running this railway, and bearing in mind that they could not charge passengers for the lower for this section on the incline. Passengers could go free of charge. If you run a railway for 15 years without charging passengers, you soon run out of money. And by 1898 they called it a day and actually closed the railway as well, even though there was this obligation to keep it open. And it stayed disused for nearly 10 years until the brief reopening 1907 with the Mineral Syndicate, nothing to do with the Ebervale Company. And again, I told you how they got the drums working by blowing up the Rally's Cross engines and using that ballast to operate the incline. The Roby engine was worn out, but they overhauled it, and that went down to the bottom of the incline, and that engine was used to drive a compressor for their new venture, which was called Timwood Tunnel, and they sunk most of their money fruitlessly driving a tunnel they went in 1,600 feet into the hillside and found nothing at all.
Gosh.
Before they ran out of money and went broke. And in a last-ditch attempt to use some of the poor ore that they're taken out of Colton, and that was the only mine they could use without reverting to pumping or drainage, they took this very poor ore. They took the Roby engine from Timwood and took it to Washford and built what we call a bricketing works, which is really no more than what I call a glorified concrete block making plant, and compressed the poor ore into briquettes and tried to fire those into usable blocks that they could transport across to South Wales. Cost them something like £2,000 to build the kiln at Washford. Started it in April and it was operating by July, and then they went bust. And that sold cost them £2,000, but it sold for £5 for demolition. So all the ventures here lost money. Come 1917, and of course during the First World War, all redundant railways were commandeered for munitions. And of course the rails here, everything was still in place, so it was systematically stripped back on the upper section. All the rails slid down the incline, taken across to South Wales to be melted down. But it left those two cast iron drums in there, these big drums, a lot of metal in them. And the demolition contractor decided the easiest way to get those out was to put explosives in here, and they were blown up. In doing so, it took out both of these walls, and they were a pile of rubble until the late 1930s, when Mr. Norman, across the road in the house, decided he would rebuild them and convert this into an agricultural store building. I think it was rather grand, and they're second-hand windows, and that's why these windows are metal windows and they don't match the original design, which would have been a sliding sash window. But they are part of the history of the building, hence they are as they are. Okay, I've done a lot of talking. Is there any questions?
Did you use this then as an agricultural building? Did you put a roof on it?
No.
No.
Never ever finished it. Like everything here, it's a failed venture.